Benjamin Carter Het is on the line with us. Benjamin Carter Het is a former trial lawyer. He's now a professor of history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center at City University of New York. He's the author of numerous books. His most recent, The Death of Democracy. You can tweet him at Benjamin Het, H-E-T-T. Benjamin Carter Het, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Well, and thank you for writing a brilliant book here. The book is basically about Hitler's rise. In fact, the subtitle is Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic. So the question is, how did democracy fall apart in Germany in the 1930s so quickly, so suddenly, particularly when you look at, I remember reading Schirer's book, back in the day, and the difference between 1933 and the end of 1934 was radical. I mean, such a shift in just a couple of years. How did this come about, and what does this tell us about how we should be, or even if we should be concerned about this sort of thing happening in our democracy? Is this the kind of thing that we're seeing happening in other democracies like Orban's Hungary or Erdogan's Turkey?
Yeah, well, thank you. Those are all great and I think important questions. And they're the questions that I have certainly been concerned with since I started thinking about this project and working on it. So I think, first of all, the quick answer to how could democracy fall apart so quickly is that it actually didn't exactly fall apart. It was killed. It was killed by people who set out to do that. And I think one of the things that a lot of people don't necessarily know about the Weimar Republic, and a lot of historians have presented it differently, but I think one of the things that's pretty clear from the record is that Germany about 1925, 1926, 1927 was doing pretty well, and democracy was in pretty good shape up against a lot of really dramatic obstacles, political and economic and what have you. And it's at this moment that people from various directions politically started working away at the system to take it down, to literally destroy the democracy and replace it with something that would be both more authoritarian and more congenial to the interests of some of the powerful people who were setting out to do this. That's part of the story.
Was it largely that simple, that this was people who were seeking wealth and power?
Well, part of the story is absolutely that simple. So, for instance, the big business community in Germany, particularly some of the heavy industries like steel and so on, were very frustrated by the fact that they felt they were losing from democracy because the new democracy that had come in 1918, 1919 had put a lot more regulation on business. There was a national wage arbitration system which tended to push wages up. And so for this reason, they wanted to do away with the democratic system. The military was frustrated that the democratic parliament wasn't voting enough money for armaments. But then there is definitely another side to this. There were people who were being hurt by the effects of economic globalization in Germany at this time, or we would call it that now. They didn't use the word then. So, for instance, farmers who were going bankrupt because world food prices were dropping and German farmers had trouble competing.
This is the result of the worldwide Great Depression.
Well, it comes in a little before that. Even in about the middle of the 1920s, before the famous crash on Wall Street in 1929, there's already this economic series of problems that's hitting a lot of people in Germany. And so there's a lot of anger there, particularly concentrated in some rural areas of northern and eastern Germany, and they start gravitating towards what's basically a protest movement that moves far to the right with this protest, and that is sort of the beginnings of a groundswell of popular support for Hitler and the Nazis. And so these two things intersect, basically.
Is there, I always cringe when people, well, and I've done it myself, make Nazi analogies to, modern America. Yeah. But if, what's the old saying, those who fail to learn history are doomed to repeat it or learn from history. What application of this history, what understanding of this history do we need to bring into our current political dialogue or our current body politic?
Yeah, that's a great question too, and I think my answer to that is, you're absolutely right that comparisons to Nazi Germany can be sloppy and not thought through, and they're just a kind of rhetorical A-bomb. But there are some structural factors going on in American politics right now and in other countries. You mentioned Hungary, and there's a number of others. There are some structural factors going on that that resemble a lot of what was happening in Germany and in other places in the 1920s and 1930s. And I think these structural factors are things to be concerned about. The rise of right-wing populism, the fact that in our country, I think, mainstream conservative elites have decided that it works for them to make an alliance with right-wing populism. That really recapitulates what happened in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. And I think very importantly, a kind of growing contempt for truth, for facts, a growing willingness to employ blatantly false statements in propaganda. That is something which also very much resembles the German politics of the 20s and 30s, and also I find deeply worrying.
To what extent? I mean, we look at Duterte in the Philippines. You know, he's murdered. It's estimated now over 10,000 people, mostly drug users. Has authorized his police to literally just walk up to people, put a gun to their head, and shoot them if they have drug paraphernalia. And there doesn't seem to be the institutional democracy of the Philippines is not dealing with that at all. It seems. Orban in Hungary, he's talking about actually rewriting the constitution. You've got Erdogan in Turkey, who's been ruling over a military dictatorship essentially ever since the attempted coup. You've got El-Sisi in Egypt, who took over by military coup. I mean, these are all countries that we thought of as democracies. Maybe Egypt a little more of a flaky democracy, but and they have all fallen. Have they all fallen according to a particular pattern that we see writ large in Germany in the 30s, or do they each have their own unique ways of going? In other words, is there some sort of a kind of systemic or systematic, perhaps as a flaw of the way democracies work, or the way that capitalism works, or the way that capitalism can corrode politics if it's not restrained? Is there something here that's a consistent thread, or are these all unique? And how does that apply to us?
Yeah, I mean, probably the answer is somewhere in the middle. I wouldn't claim to be an expert particularly on, say, Turkish or Egyptian politics, but I do think in a general sort of way, and certainly if you look at what's happening in some of the European countries, in Germany or France, for instance, or Britain with Brexit, I think you do see something which is both a bit similar to things we're experiencing right now in the United States, and let me, zoom back to the thing that I actually know professionally about. It is a little bit, more than a little bit, alarmingly similar to what was happening in Germany in the 20s and 30s, and that is that a capitalist system without sufficient sort of regulatory checks and without structures for correcting the sort of inherent unequal distribution of wealth that's going to tend to result from a capitalist system will breed anger and discontent pretty much as sure as the sun comes up in the morning. And I think what we've seen since, say, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the advent of a number of new democracies in Eastern Europe, we have seen a very rapid process of kind of disenchantment with what liberal democracy and liberal capitalism can bring. And here's another, I think, really both very
by liberal, by the way, you're using the term in the European context, meaning unregulated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Forgive my interruption.
No, not at all. And there's, I think, a really profound parallel here to the world after World War I, because in the years immediately after World War I, you saw some of the same thing, and in some of the same places. You saw a bunch of new democracies being created where there had been authoritarian states before, but very quickly those democracies failed because they were not able to manage certain kinds of conflicts. Some of them were national group conflicts within borders. Some of them were economic conflicts. And so in much the same way, a kind of euphoric tide of democracy spreading around 1919 had kind of slid into the authoritarian tide of the late 20s and into the 30s. So, you get to a point by the end of the 1930s, really the only democracies left in Europe, major ones, are France and Britain, whereas in 1919, pretty much all countries were democratic. And I'm concerned that we are seeing a bit of a replay of that now.
Yeah. So finally, Benjamin, we're talking with Benjamin Carter Head, his new book, The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic. What specifically should Americans be pushing for in terms of political change or political understanding or institutional strengthening, or what? How do we prevent this sort of thing from happening here?
Well, I think one thing that I'm very happy about is that we have still a federal system, a functioning federal system, which will somewhat inhibit the effects of what can and has happened in other countries. But more directly to your point, I think Americans need to insist on a certain kind of political mobilization which works to counteract some of the inequalities and injustices that result from the kinds of systems that we live in. There's no doubt that those exist, and I think there's no doubt that that's what's fueling a lot of the right-wing populism we're seeing in our country now. I think, those young people in Florida, after the horrible school shooting, that has been one of the most inspiring things that I can remember seeing in many years in politics in this country. I think that's an example of sort of effective grassroots, but very savvy political mobilization directed at addressing a serious problem. And I think that's something we could all draw a bit of inspiration from.
So we need to stand up, speak out, and get active.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Benjamin Carter Het, the book is The Death of Democracy, just published by Henry Holt & Company. Check it out.